Ari Aster, one of the most divisive, maybe controversial, but also somewhat acclaimed auteurs in recent years, has just released his fourth feature film, Eddington, and I thought now would be a great time to rank his career so far. As you know, despite his divisivity, in a sense, especially with his past couple of films, I do really like his work, and I think he is one of the most intriguing and kind of audacious filmmakers working today. Before I start, I will say that I at least like all of his work, although I'll briefly mention I will not be ranking any of his short films, which I think are just flat out terrible. Strange Thing About the Johnsons, or whatever that one is called, and Beau, which would eventually become Beau is Afraid, are both really bad. I think watching those and then seeing what he's done with Hereditary, his debut, it's kind of impressive, the jump he made when he went from short to feature film. The jump in talent and just quality level generally is really staggering, and really shows that even the people that end up becoming some of the most talented filmmakers in the world got to start from somewhere. And where he started was making really bland kind of shock value for the sake of shock value, psychological horror that you do see some like kernels of, some elements of within his feature films, but he's definitely honed his style and honed his craft in a way that makes all four of his feature films at least interesting or somewhat good. Like, I think all of them are fun times, although that's a strange way to describe an Ari Aster film, as he is quite known for making these very nightmarish and psychologically disturbing films. But I'll get into all of that when I start to rank his films, which I am going to do right now, starting with number 4. Beau is Afraid, his third feature film, came out in 2023 and stars Joaquin Phoenix as a man with crippling anxiety and an Oedipus complex, who, upon learning the news of his mother getting smashed by a chandelier, embarks on an odyssey to go see her, which takes up about 3 hours of runtime. This movie is very long, quite self-indulgent in a lot of ways, and I typically enjoy auteurs making films like this that are kind of vanity projects and are a lot of them throwing everything in the kitchen sink at the viewer. Damien Chazelle's Babylon is another great example in recent years of films like this, where a filmmaker is just given a blank check and they really go all out. And typically these films end up being quite flawed, but also some of the most interesting films of whatever year they come out in, and Beau is Afraid is no exception. A lot of really great sequences within this film, although my main complaint is that it doesn't really tie itself together quite well within the ending, largely because it doesn't take itself seriously enough to warrant its runtime. Like, if you're going to make a 3-hour film, you should make the ending feel satisfying and like it is, I don't know, weighty in some sense, because a viewer is waiting 180 minutes for this conclusion. You want the conclusion, the final shot, the final 5 minutes, the final 20 minutes to really pop. And the third act of Beau is Afraid does anything but pop. It's actually easily the worst part of this entire film, and kind of feels like a giant middle finger to the viewer, like you wasted your time watching this film. It's basically like a troll of an ending, and is really dissatisfying, and intentionally so, but not in a way that I find to be compelling. In fact, it's quite obnoxious, which is a shame because the rest of the film around this ending is quite good. This is the first time that Ari Aster has deviated from the horror of his first 2 films and his short films, and there is a lot of horror aspects within Beau is Afraid, but it is largely a dark absurdist comedy, aiming to put the viewer in the subjective mindset of a character with anxiety in the modern world, someone who sees the worst in any situation, and as a result, you get the sense of exaggerated realism within the first hour and a half of this film, because obviously there are, cities in America that have this sort of sketchy atmosphere to them that you kind of see within the first hour of Beau is Afraid, where he's just in his apartment. But obviously it is really like leaning into it and exaggerating it to an absurd extent. Joaquin is great in this film. It's very difficult to write a passive protagonist, and it's even more difficult to perform as a passive protagonist. But Beau is the epitome of a passive protagonist, as nothing within this film really happens of his own volition. He either makes a choice because he doesn't have any other choice, or things are just sort of thrust upon him. He never makes an active active decision within the film. He's not an active protagonist in any sense. And typically you want a lead who is driving the action forwards, but Joaquin does a great job of kind of performing this very bumbling, weird, very funny character who is simultaneously really frustrating to watch because you just want to see him actually do something about these terrible situations he finds himself in. But the horror and sort of the comedy of the film is that he's never going to, because of the way that he has been raised and just the way that he has lived his life. It just has, in a sense, set him up for failure, set him up for this anxiety-ridden life. For a 3-hour movie, it is relatively well-paced, albeit a little bit uneven, as these sequences don't feel particularly connected, especially as you get further into the film, and that exaggerated realism of the first hour gives way to pure surrealism in the last 2 hours. In a particularly incredible sequence, Beau is watching this play that's like his entire life, and it gets very dreamlike, it gets very atmospheric, and it's really, really gorgeous. Honestly, one of the best sequences that Ari Aster has shot in his entire career. But then this sequence leads directly into the really disappointing third act of this film. So it's very uneven, it's quite flawed, it's relatively well paced, but you still feel the 3-hour runtime by the end. I think the self-indulgence and the lack of self-editing on Aster's part throughout this film means Beau is Afraid is his most shoddy and messy film that has some high highs, but definitely the lowest lows in his filmography. At number 3, we have Eddington, which is his most recent film, came out just last week, and I did a review on, so if you want to hear me talk about that film as well as analyze it, kind of, I did that video a few days ago. For now, I will briefly go into my thoughts on this film, specifically within the context of Aster's filmography, as this is the first time that he has fully split from the horror genre. There's some horror elements in this, but it's largely a neo-Western political conspiracy, thriller, satire, dark comedy. There's a lot going on here genre-wise, and Aster does a pretty great job of blending it all together. The cast is really good, and it is one of the more thought-provoking films of this year. I think Aster is making a lot of bold choices creatively, as well as saying a lot of bold things that are definitely subject to criticism, but ultimately he dissects the current political landscape of America and the political landscape during the COVID pandemic in an unorthodox way that sort of points to the fact that everyone within American politics is sort of out for themselves and doesn't really have a lot of morals to them. He uses the small town of Eddington as a microcosm of the greater landscape of America, but never makes any of these characters feel like stereotypes or caricatures of a specific type of person that you'll see within the world. All these characters are really well written, really fleshed out. In fact, my main criticism is that we don't get enough time with certain characters, specifically Austin Butler's, and instead we are seeing the entire film through Joe Cross's perspective, Joaquin Phoenix's character, which I think is because Aster, for the most part, seems to connect or relate most to this character, and as a result he sort of wants the audience to see the world through this person's eyes, which is another example of Aster making a somewhat self-indulgent and kind of self-centered choice within his films. I think that is probably the biggest con of his filmography so far. But despite that criticism, Eddington is still a really thought-provoking film that also functions as a really great comedic satire that sees Aster really pushing himself both as a filmmaker and as a screenwriter, tackling a lot of the most controversial topics within America right now, and doing so with a significant amount of sensitivity, but also a little bit of carelessness that makes Eddington quite divisive, but still incredibly interesting to me. At number 2, we have Hereditary, his debut feature film. I'll just say, because now if you know Aster's filmography, you probably know what number 1 is. I had a hard time choosing between number 1 and number 2. I think the bottom 2 of his filmography is pretty clear, and the top 2 of his filmography are clear. But how you position them is a little bit less clear. If you were to ask me in a few months what his best film is, I might have a completely different opinion. I might go with Hereditary. But for now, I'm going to put Hereditary at number 2, and I'll sort of explain why I think the number 1 choice is better when I get to it. But Hereditary is certainly an incredible film, a really great horror movie, and something that proved to be very influential within the horror genre and just filmmaking in general. Hereditary's style of like art house elevated horror, where everything is sort of a metaphor for trauma or grief or family, has been replicated countless times in the past few years and has really never been topped. A lot of times a really great horror movie will come out and critics will immediately hail it as one of the scariest movies of all time and really hype it up, leading to somewhat high expectations from viewers. And oftentimes these films never meet those sky-high expectations, but Hereditary is a rare example of that hype being matched and in some ways exceeded. This film is absolutely terrifying and also just a really great movie. Toni Collette is incredible in the lead performance here. The final 20 or so minutes is just like jaw-dropping great horror filmmaking. It's rare for a director to immediately have this amount of confidence in just their debut, but this is an incredibly confidently made film. Aster knows exactly what he's trying to say, exactly how he wants to say it, exactly what he wants to film, and exactly how he wants to film it, which is why Hereditary is just such a bold and refreshing take in the horror genre that immediately propelled Aster into the upper echelon of horror filmmaking. I don't really have a lot of complaints or reasons why this should be number 2 and the number 1 film should be number 1. But I just think that number 1 is a bit more impressive on a filmmaking level. And that number 1 is Midsommar, his second feature film, starring Florence Pugh. A lot of people talk about Toni Collette's performance in Hereditary as being one of the best horror performances of all time. I would say that Florence Pugh's performance is just as good, if not better. A lot of Midsommar hinges on close-ups of Florence Pugh and her really nailing the grief, the despair, the somewhat melancholy happiness in certain moments, and she nails it. This is probably her best performance so far. This film starts off at 100. It's already pretty disturbing, and then it just kind of keeps ramping up its disturbing nature until the last 30 minutes are basically just like a bunch of people screaming while we get a lot of like disgusting, grotesque imagery. Aster is just so great and so in tune and how he is going to make his viewers feel. He creates a lot of disorienting visuals and haunting imagery within this film that just really keeps you uneasy and keeps building up towards that absolute fever dream of a third act. It's really everything you'd want from a horror movie, even just a movie in general. It's a little bit funny. It's definitely dramatically interesting. It's thematically intriguing. It is really, really scary. Incredibly well shot and has a bunch of great performances in it, along with just a dynamite central performance. It's definitely not a movie I revisit often, as it is kind of a bad time, but it is certainly an impressive feat of filmmaking, and in my opinion, it is Aster's best film. So that's all I got, really. This was Ari Aster ranked, only 4 films so far. I'm very excited to see what he is going to continue to do, if he'll go back to the horror genre, maybe if he'll just keep going down this rabbit hole of trying new things each film. I'm not sure, but only 4 films in, and he is already one of my favorite filmmakers working right now. Next week, I will be reviewing Fantastic Four, very different from, talking about Ari Aster. And yeah, that's it. Bye-bye.